She had always believed she was untouchable, entitled, possessed of an almost immutable authority within the gleaming metal confines of the aircraft. But in the suffocating span of a single impulsive moment, one brutal, ill-considered mistake, she had detonated everything. A flight attendant, blinded by prejudice and bloated with self-importance, humiliated an elderly woman. The stinging slap echoing to the hushed cabin, delivered in full view of horrified passengers. Danielle Callaway hadn't known, couldn't have fathomed the catastrophic fallout of her actions, the devastating ripple effects of her unchecked arrogance. She hadn't understood, in that flash of blind fury, who she had just laid hands upon, whose quiet dignity she had so casually shattered. Because the woman's husband, Charles Gardner, wasn't just a disgruntled passenger demanding an apology. He owned the airline. And now, as the wheels of Flight 347 kissed the tarmac, as a heavy metal bird rumbled to a halt, Danielle wasn't simply facing an angry complaint, a perfunctory reprimand, a slap on the wrist. She was about to lose everything: her career, her reputation, her carefully constructed identity. Stay until the bitter end, because what unfolded next in the sterile confines of the airport terminal, under the cold, unforgiving glare of fluorescent lights, was a meticulously orchestrated dismantling, a public execution of a career that no one on that flight, least of all Danielle herself, was remotely prepared for. But before we descend into the chilling aftermath, before the inevitable hammer blow falls, tell us in the comments below, from what corner of the globe are you witnessing this unfolding drama? And if you appreciate stories that delve into the dark undercurrents of human nature, that explore the intoxicating allure and devastating consequences of unchecked power, be sure to like, subscribe, and activate notifications, ensuring you never miss a new descent into the shadowed heart of human fallibility. The airport throbbed with frenetic energy, a restless hive of transient souls in perpetual motion. The cavernous terminal echoed with the usual urban symphony, the amplified drone of disembodied announcements echoing across vast distances, the insistent clatter of wheeled suitcases dragging across polished floors, the urgent, overlapping murmur of 1,000 voices, each a fleeting thread in the tapestry of human transience. Amidst this swirling current of humanity, Eloise Gardner, an elderly woman in her late 70s, navigated the crowded spaces with quiet, almost ethereal grace. She wasn't caught up in the frantic pace of most travelers, didn't exude the restless anticipation of those eager to reach their destinations. She had traversed continents, spanned oceans, lived through decades, centuries even it seemed, bearing witness to joys and sorrows that had etched lines of quiet wisdom onto her face, leaving her too seasoned, too profoundly experienced, to be rattled by anything so trivial, so fleeting, as the hurried chaos of an airport terminal. Dressed in a soft, dove-gray shawl, its delicate fabric whispering with every movement, draped over a neatly pressed dress the color of faded lavender, her silver hair, a crown of spun moonlight, pinned in a classic, elegant updo, she carried herself with the inherent dignity of someone who had weathered storms, absorbed countless blows, and emerged not unscathed but unbroken, her spirit tempered by time, her resolve strengthened by experience. In one hand, she carried a simple, unassuming leather purse, worn soft with age and use, its contents as discreet and understated as its owner. In the other, she held a small, lightweight carry-on bag, its contents carefully curated, thoughtfully chosen, containing only the essentials for her journey, a reflection of her practiced efficiency, her quiet self-sufficiency. Reaching the hushed sanctuary of the first-class boarding lane, a velvet rope separating the privileged few from the teeming masses beyond, she presented her ticket to the gate agent, a polite, fresh-faced young man, his demeanor radiating youthful eagerness, his uniform crisp and impeccable. He scanned the boarding pass, the electronic beep of soft punctuation in the hushed atmosphere, and smiled, his gaze warm, genuinely welcoming. "Welcome aboard, Mrs. Gardner," he said, his voice respectful, courteous, bordering on deferential. "Have a wonderful flight." Eloise gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, a subtle acknowledgment of his kindness, a silent appreciation for his professional courtesy, then made her way slowly, deliberately, down the carpeted expanse of Jet Bridge, the muffled sound of the airport receding behind her, the promise of quietude, of respite, of escape, beckoning her forward. Inside the hushed, softly lit cabin, the privileged sanctuary of first class, the select few passengers were already ensconced in their wide, plush seats, their postures radiating an air of relaxed entitlement, of quiet self-possession. Some adjusted thick, luxurious blankets, cashmere and merino wool whispering against the air. Others sipped delicately from stemmed glasses, the clinking of crystal a subtle counterpoint to the muted murmur of polite conversation, the low, almost imperceptible hum of affluence. The air itself felt different, rarefied, subtly perfumed with the scent of freshly tanned leather, the delicate floral notes of expensive perfume, the faint, underlying aroma of privilege and exclusivity. Eloise walked slowly, deliberately, down the aisle, her gaze scanning the numbered seat rows, her movements measured, graceful, unhurried. She reached seat 1B, a coveted window seat in the first row, and carefully, methodically, placed her small carry-on bag near her feet, sliding it discreetly beneath the seat ahead, her movements economical, efficient, almost invisible. Before she could fully settle in, before she could even adjust her shawl, a voice, sharp, insistent, cutting through the hushed quietude of the cabin like a shard of glass, arrested her movements. "Excuse me, ma'am." Eloise turned slowly, deliberately, her gaze lifting to meet the source of the imperious interruption. Standing over her, blocking the soft light from the cabin window, was a tall, imposing flight attendant, her posture radiating an almost aggressive sense of self-importance, her stance stiff, demanding, her presence radiating an unspoken expectation of immediate, unquestioning obedience. Danielle Callaway, her name tag, pinned precisely to her impeccably crisp uniform, gleamed under the soft cabin lights, a small, metallic symbol of her authority, her perceived dominance within the enclosed world of the aircraft. Danielle's crisp uniform was flawlessly tailored, each seam precisely pressed, each pleat perfectly aligned, a visual representation of her meticulous control, her unwavering adherence to protocol, her unwavering belief in her own authority. Her expression, carefully composed, yet undeniably tight with barely concealed irritation, betrayed a simmering impatience, a barely suppressed annoyance at the perceived inconvenience, the unwelcome intrusion into her carefully orchestrated domain. Eloise gave a small, polite nod, her expression calm, unruffled, her gaze direct, unwavering, betraying no hint of intimidation, no flicker of unease. "Yes." Danielle's eyes, sharp and assessing, flickered dismissively to the boarding pass, still clutched loosely in Eloise's hand, a gesture of subtle disdain, a silent accusation of misplaced privilege. "This is first class," Danielle stated, her voice slow, deliberately condescending, her tone suggesting she was patiently explaining something profoundly complicated, something utterly beyond the elderly woman's limited comprehension. Eloise raised a perfectly sculpted silver eyebrow, her expression still calm, still unperturbed, still betraying no hint of ruffled feathers, no flicker of irritation, no hint of ruffled feathers. "I'm aware," she replied, her voice quiet, measured, utterly devoid of defensiveness, her tone suggesting a quiet amusement at the flight attendant's thinly veiled condescension. Danielle hesitated, a flicker of uncertainty crossing her carefully composed features, a subtle hint of her carefully constructed facade beginning to crack. Then, with a curt, dismissive gesture, she held out a hand, her palm upturned, her fingers extended, a silent, imperious demand. "May I see your ticket?" Eloise, still silent, still unhurried, still unflappable, handed it over without a word, her movements graceful, fluid, utterly unperturbed by the flight attendant's blatant display of barely concealed suspicion. Danielle snatched the boarding pass, her fingers grasping at the thin paper with unnecessary force, inspecting it with meticulous scrutiny, her eyes narrowing slightly, scanning the printed details as if searching for some hidden flaw, some telltale sign of deception. The name, printed clearly in elegant, serif font, undeniably matched the seat number, 1B, and the first-class designation. Yet, despite the undeniable evidence before her eyes, despite the clear validation of the boarding pass, Danielle still looked skeptical, her expression betraying a lingering disbelief, an ingrained prejudice that refused to be easily dismissed. She handed it back to Eloise with a forced, brittle smile, a gesture of feigned politeness that masked her simmering resentment, her barely concealed disdain. "Just making sure," she said, her voice tight, her smile strained, her words devoid of genuine warmth, her tone suggesting that the elderly woman was, at best, an anomaly, at worst, an unwelcome interloper in the exclusive world of first class. Eloise nodded again, a small, almost knowing movement, her expression remaining calm, composed, utterly unperturbed, her silence speaking volumes, her quiet dignity a stark contrast to the flight attendant's barely concealed hostility. She knew, instinctively, precisely what this was. It wasn't the first time, not by a long shot, that someone, some younger, more privileged, more outwardly assertive individual, had assumed she didn't belong somewhere, had judged her based on appearances, had underestimated her based on her age, her quiet demeanor, her understated elegance. She sat down gracefully, adjusting her soft shawl, her movements fluid, unhurried, her gaze turning deliberately toward the window, dismissing the flight attendant with a quiet, unspoken finality. A few minutes stretched into an eternity. The last remaining passengers boarded, their hurried movements a sharp contrast to the hushed elegance of first class. The overhead bins were being closed with soft, muffled thuds. The cabin lights dimmed slightly, signaling the imminent departure. Eloise reached for her purse, intending to retrieve a book, a literary escape from the mundane reality of air travel, a quiet refuge in the pages of a well-loved novel. When Danielle returned, her shadow falling over Eloise again, blocking out the already meager cabin light, her presence radiating an almost palpable tension. This time, the flight attendant's forced smile was even tighter, more brittle, more strained, as if she were actively, consciously, holding back a torrent of barely suppressed frustration, a simmering rage threatening to erupt. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but I need you to move." Eloise turned her gaze slowly, deliberately, away from the window, her expression calm, unhurried, her eyes meeting Danielle's with unwavering directness. "Move." Danielle's face tightened further, her lips pressing into a thin, bloodless line, her voice now carrying an unmistakable edge of impatience, of barely concealed aggression. "Yes," Danielle stated, crossing her arms defensively across her chest, her posture rigid, confrontational, her gaze fixed on Eloise, challenging her to resist. "There seems to be a mistake," she said, the word dripping with insincerity, laced with subtle, almost imperceptible hint of sarcasm. "This seat," she continued, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, yet still carrying clearly across the hushed space of the first-class cabin, her gaze darting nervously around as if fearful of being overheard. "This seat isn't available for you." Silence stretched between them, heavy, pregnant, charged with unspoken tension, the air itself seeming to thicken, to constrict around them. A few passengers in the surrounding seats shifted uncomfortably, their gazes averted, their bodies angled away, pretending not to listen, desperately feigning disinterest in the escalating confrontation, their postures radiating a palpable desire to disappear, to become invisible, to avoid being drawn into the unfolding drama. Eloise took a slow, deliberate breath, the scent of recirculated air and faint perfume doing little to soothe the rising tide of indignation within her, a familiar, weary anger at the casual arrogance, the ingrained prejudice, the blatant disrespect she was once again, inexplicably being subjected to. She had spent her life, a long, fulfilling life dedicated to education, to empowerment, to instilling in generations of students the importance of standing up for themselves, the unwavering value of dignity, the inherent right to respect. She had raised a family, instilled in her children and grandchildren a deep understanding of fairness, of compassion, of the imperative to challenge injustice wherever they found it, no matter how subtle, how insidious, how deeply ingrained. She wasn't about to shrink now, not at this late stage in her life, not after all she had endured, not in the face of such blatant, unprovoked disrespect. "And," she asked, her voice calm, measured, utterly devoid of anger, yet carrying an undeniable undercurrent of steel, of quiet resolve. "And what kind of passenger?" She paused, her gaze unwavering, her voice now laced with subtle, almost imperceptible edge of irony. "What kind of passenger am I, Miss Callaway? That this seat, a seat clearly assigned to me, a seat I have rightfully purchased, is somehow unavailable? For me?" Danielle's carefully constructed composure faltered, her practiced smile cracking, her expression faltering for a fleeting, almost imperceptible, split second, a flicker of uncertainty, a hint of dawning realization that she had perhaps underestimated, miscalculated, profoundly misjudged the quiet dignity, the inherent strength of the elderly woman before her. "I just meant," Danielle stammered, her voice losing its earlier sharpness, her confidence subtly, almost imperceptibly, eroding, her carefully crafted facade beginning to crumble under the weight of Eloise's unwavering gaze, her quiet, pointed question, her undeniable, unyielding presence. Eloise raised a hand, her movements graceful, yet undeniably firm, a gesture that brooked no further evasion, no further obfuscation, no further attempts at thinly veiled discrimination. "If there's a real issue," Eloise stated, her voice now carrying a quiet authority, a subtle command that resonated to the hushed cabin, demanding attention, commanding respect. "If there's a genuine issue, Miss Callaway, with my assigned seat," she concluded, her gaze unwavering, her voice leaving no room for further argument, "I'd like to hear it from a captain." Danielle's jaw tightened, her lips pressing into a thin, bloodless line, her frustration now palpable, bordering on outright rage, her carefully constructed facade of professional composure threatening to shatter completely. But before she could muster another thinly veiled insult, before she could launch into another patronizing demand, another voice, younger, softer, yet carrying a subtle undercurrent of quiet defiance, of nascent rebellion, broke the oppressive tension. "Is there a problem here?" A younger flight attendant, Emily Reed, had been watching the escalating confrontation from the relative safety of the galley, her initial apprehension now giving way to a dawning unease, a rising sense of unease, a growing conviction that something profoundly wrong, something ethically compromised, was unfolding before her eyes. She stepped forward, her face etched with uncertainty, her gaze shifting nervously between Danielle and Eloise, her presence a subtle challenge to the established hierarchy of the cabin, a quiet assertion of her own conscience, her own moral compass. Unlike Danielle, whose features were contorted with barely suppressed irritation, Emily's concern seemed genuine, her approach hesitant, yet undeniably sincere, her posture betraying a quiet unease, a growing discomfort at the unfolding injustice. Danielle turned sharply towards Emily, her movements jerky, her gaze flashing with a barely concealed anger, a possessive territoriality, a clear message to the younger flight attendant to stay out of her carefully orchestrated domain of perceived authority. "No problem at all," Danielle snapped, her voice stiff, brittle, laced with thinly veiled hostility, her smile forced, unnatural, a grotesque parody of genuine warmth. "No problem at all," she repeated, her voice now even more strained, more insistent, her gaze fixed on Emily, warning her to back down, to retreat back into the shadows of the galley, to remain silent, to remain complicit. "I was just about to," Danielle continued, her voice faltering, her carefully constructed narrative unraveling, her carefully crafted lie beginning to crumble under the weight of Emily's unwavering gaze, her quiet, unspoken challenge. "I was just about to," she repeated again, her voice now almost pleading, almost desperate. "Ask Mrs. Gardner to move where—" Emily asked then, her brow furrowed in confusion, her gaze shifting between Danielle and Eloise, her voice carrying a quiet incredulity, a dawning realization of the absurdity, the injustice, of Danielle's thinly veiled discrimination. "Move where, Danielle?" she repeated, her voice barely audible, yet carrying an undeniable weight of unspoken accusation, a silent challenge to Danielle's authority, a quiet assertion of her own moral compass. Danielle hesitated, her carefully constructed justifications collapsing around her, her carefully crafted lies unraveling, her carefully constructed narrative dissolving into a puddle of blatant prejudice and unchecked arrogance. The economy section, she knew, was fully booked, every seat occupied, every overhead bin overflowing, every aisle crowded with restless passengers. She had expected, had fully anticipated, had even, in a way, desired Eloise to quietly, meekly leave, to retreat, to disappear, to walk away without question, without protest, without causing a scene, without challenging her perceived authority, her carefully constructed dominance within the enclosed world of the aircraft cabin. But now, With another crew member watching, with Emily's quiet challenge hanging in the air, with the eyes of the first-class passengers subtly, yet undeniably, fixed on her, she was stuck, trapped, exposed. Eloise, throughout the escalating confrontation, throughout Danielle's thinly veiled insults and blatant displays of prejudice, had remained utterly still, utterly composed, utterly unperturbed. Her posture straight, her gaze steady, her expression unreadable. She held her ground, her quiet dignity an impenetrable shield against the venomous barbs of Danielle's unchecked arrogance. "I'm not moving," Eloise stated then, her voice calm, measured, utterly devoid of any hint of anger, any trace of fear, any flicker of intimidation. Her words, simple, direct, yet carrying an undeniable weight of quiet resolve, hung in the air, a quiet act of defiance against injustice, a silent assertion of her inherent right to be there, to occupy the seat she had rightfully purchased, to claim her space in the world, regardless of age, regardless of appearance, regardless of the ingrained prejudices that sought to diminish her, to erase her, to render her invisible. Danielle's lips pressed together, her jaw clenching tightly, her frustration now boiling over, her carefully constructed facade of professional composure finally, irrevocably shattering. Then, in a move that shocked everyone present, a gesture of impulsive rage, a blatant act of unprovoked aggression that betrayed the true depths of her prejudice, her entitlement, her unchecked arrogance, she reached down, her hand a blur of motion, and grabbed Eloise's arm, her fingers digging sharply into the elderly woman's delicate skin, her grip tight, possessive, almost violent. "Listen, lady." The slap came fast, brutal, sharp, a shocking act of physical violence that reverberated to the hushed cabin, silencing every passenger, shattering the fragile veneer of civility, exposing the raw ugliness of unchecked prejudice, the brutal reality of casual cruelty. The sound, sharp and resonant, echoed to a first-class cabin, a sudden, jarring punctuation to the escalating tension, a brutal intrusion into the rarefied atmosphere of privilege, a shocking display of unprovoked aggression that silenced every passenger, shattering the fragile veneer of civility, exposing the raw ugliness of unchecked prejudice. A collective gasp, sharp and audible, rippled through first class, a wave of shock and disbelief washing over the privileged passengers, their initial voyeuristic curiosity now replaced by a palpable horror, a dawning realization of the gravity of what they had just witnessed, the undeniable brutality of the act, the shocking violation of basic human decency. Some turned their heads away, their faces averted, unable to bear witness to the raw ugliness of the scene. Others stiffened in their seats, their bodies rigid with shock, their minds struggling to process the casual cruelty they had just witnessed, the blatant disregard for human dignity, the casual act of violence inflicted upon an elderly woman by a figure of authority, a representative of the very airline that was ostensibly responsible for their safety and comfort. Danielle froze, her hand still raised, suspended in midair, her fingers still curled into a claw, as if she herself couldn't quite believe what she had just done, as if she were suddenly, belatedly, confronted with the horrifying reality of her own unchecked rage, the brutal manifestation of her ingrained prejudice. Eloise had turned slightly with the force of the slap, her silver hair shifting against her soft cheek, her body momentarily recoiling from the unexpected physical assault. But when she looked back at Danielle, her gaze unwavering, her posture still erect, her expression impossibly wasn't one of anger, wasn't one of shock, wasn't one of fear, wasn't even one of pain. It was something else entirely, something far more unsettling, far more devastating, far more profoundly damning. It was disappointment. Deep, quiet, soul-deep disappointment. Passengers in first class sat utterly frozen, their postures rigid, their breath held captive in their chests, their eyes wide with a mixture of horror, fascination, and a dawning sense of complicity in the unfolding drama. No one moved, no one spoke, no one dared to break the oppressive silence, the heavy weight of unspoken judgment hanging in the air like a palpable fog. The younger flight attendant, Emily, had gone utterly pale, her face drained of color, her mouth slightly open, her eyes wide with horror, her body frozen in place, a statue of stunned disbelief. Eloise, despite the shock of the physical assault, despite the sting of the unexpected blow, said nothing. She uttered not a single word of protest, no cry of pain, no gasp of fear, no outraged demand for justice. She simply reached down, her movements deliberate, unhurried, unaffected, and picked up her phone, the sleek, modern device a stark contrast to the ancient wisdom etched on her face. Her fingers, still elegant, still graceful despite the passage of time, moved swiftly across the screen, typing a short, concise message, her gaze focused, her expression unwavering, her action speaking volumes in the suffocating silence. Then, with quiet dignity, with an almost regal composure, she folded her hands neatly in her lap, her posture erect, her gaze fixed serenely out the window, as if the chaotic, brutal scene unfolding around her held no further interest, no further significance, no further power to disturb her quiet equanimity. And she waited, patiently, calmly, undeniably, powerfully. And as she did, as the silence stretched, as the tension thickened, as the weight of unspoken consequences pressed down on a hushed cabin, Danielle Callaway, for the first time perhaps ever in her privileged, authority-driven life, had no idea, no inkling, no premonition of the devastating storm she had just unleashed, of the catastrophic repercussions she had so carelessly, so arrogantly set in motion. She had no idea that she had just made the biggest, most irreversible, most career-ending mistake of her life. Danielle's breath came in ragged gasps, her chest rising and falling with frantic, shallow breaths as she stared at Eloise, her mind reeling, her thoughts a chaotic jumble of panic, disbelief, and a dawning, sickening dread. She hadn't meant to do that, or at least, she hadn't consciously, deliberately planned for it to happen in such a public, undeniably witnessed way. A surge of heat flooded her face, a wave of shame, of mortification, of self-loathing washing over her. A few passengers in surrounding seats shifted uncomfortably, their averted gazes betraying a mixture of horror and morbid fascination. Some whispered to one another, their voices hushed yet audible, their words dissecting her actions with a detached, almost clinical curiosity. Others, their faces pale, their bodies rigid, pretended they hadn't seen anything at all, desperately feigning disinterest in the escalating drama, hoping to escape the unpleasant reality of human fallibility, the raw ugliness of unprovoked violence. Emily, the younger flight attendant, looked utterly horrified, her face drained of color, her eyes wide with disbelief, her posture frozen in stunned silence. "Did you just—" she started, her voice barely above a whisper, her words trailing off, unfinished, inadequate to capture the sheer audacity, the unmitigated brutality of what she had just witnessed. Danielle straightened her uniform, her fingers fumbling with the crisp fabric, a nervous tick, a desperate attempt to regain some semblance of control, some fleeting illusion of composure. She wasn't listening, she muttered under her breath, her voice barely audible, a pathetic, self-serving justification, a feeble attempt to minimize her inexcusable actions, to rationalize her unforgivable transgression. Eloise, still utterly calm, still serenely composed, still radiating an unsettling quietude, placed her phone deliberately on the armrest, the sleek device a silent witness to the unfolding drama, a tangible symbol of the unseen power, the undeniable influence. She wielded with such quiet, devastating efficiency. She didn't rub her cheek, didn't cry out in pain, didn't betray any outward sign of distress. She simply looked at Danielle, her gaze unwavering, her expression a mass of quiet, profound disappointment, a silent condemnation that cut deeper than any shouted accusation, any enraged outburst. Emily's voice rose slightly, her tone now infused with a mixture of disbelief, outrage, and a dawning apprehension, her voice trembling slightly, yet carrying an undeniable undercurrent of nascent rebellion. "You just hit a passenger, Danielle." Danielle turned sharply, her gaze flashing with a desperate, almost frantic territoriality, her voice rising to a sharp, dismissive hiss, silencing Emily before she could fully articulate her condemnation. "Stay out of this, Emily." The tension in the air became suffocating, palpable, heavy, a suffocating cloud of unspoken judgment, of dawning consequences, of impending doom. A man seated across the aisle, a businessman in a power suit, cleared his throat nervously, as if about to speak, to interject, to diffuse the escalating situation. But he quickly, wisely, looked away when Danielle's gaze, sharp, predatory, and radiating barely suppressed fury, flickered in his direction, silencing him before he could utter a single word, his posture shrinking back into his seat, his gaze fixed rigidly ahead, desperately feigning disinterest. Others, their phones now clutched tightly in their hands, their screens illuminated, betrayed their fascination, their morbid curiosity, their unspoken desire to document, to witness, to share the unfolding drama with the unseen, ever-watchful eyes of the digital world. Though it wasn't clear if they were actively recording, capturing the raw, unscripted moment of human fallibility for posterity, or just pretending to be busy, subtly documenting the escalating scene for their own private consumption, their hushed whispers, their furtive glances, their illuminated screens, all betrayed their captivated attention, their undeniable awareness that they were witnessing something extraordinary, something deeply significant, something undeniably consequential. Eloise, however, didn't need them to speak up, didn't require their verbal confirmation of the injustice she had just endured, didn't seek their fleeting validation. She already knew, instinctively, from years of experience, from a lifetime spent navigating complex currents of human interaction, precisely how these moments played out, how ingrained apathy, how the inherent human desire to avoid discomfort, how the pervasive culture of complicity, often, tragically, triumphed over the imperative to speak truth to power, to stand against injustice, to defend the vulnerable, even in the face of blatant, unprovoked aggression. Danielle took a step back, her movements jerky, almost robotic, smoothing her uniform again, her fingers fumbling with the crisp fabric, a desperate, futile attempt to regain some semblance of composure, as if somehow, by adjusting her appearance, by meticulously rearranging the external symbols of her authority, she could magically erase what had just happened, could rewind time, could undo the catastrophic mistake she had made. "I need you to move," she repeated, her voice now softer, less certain, less commanding, her earlier edge of imperious authority now noticeably, subtly, eroding, replaced by a flicker of desperation, a nascent hint of dawning fear. Eloise didn't respond, didn't acknowledge her presence, didn't even flicker an eyelash. Danielle's hands curled into tight fists at her sides, her nails digging into her palms, her frustration now escalating to a dangerous level, her carefully constructed facade of professional control threatening to shatter completely. "Fine," she hissed, her voice barely above a whisper, her tone laced with venomous resentment, a simmering rage directed not at herself, not at her own actions, but the woman who refused to be intimidated, who refused to be silenced, who refused to simply disappear. "Fine," she repeated again, her voice now carrying a thinly veiled threat, a desperate, almost pathetic, attempt to regain some vestige of control in a situation that was rapidly spiraling out of her grasp. "If you won't listen," she spat, her voice laced with barely suppressed fury, "I'll call security." She turned abruptly on her heel, her movements jerky, almost frantic, marching stiffly, purposefully, toward the front of the plane, the direction perceived authority, the assumed sanctuary of the cockpit, her heels clicking sharply against the carpeted aisle, each step a desperate attempt to reclaim her lost power, to reassert her vanishing control. Emily remained frozen for a long, agonizing second, her mind reeling, her body rigid with shock and disbelief. Then, snapping out her stunned inertia, propelled by a mixture of concern, empathy, and a nascent sense of moral responsibility, she crouched quickly, hesitantly, beside Eloise, her voice barely audible, her words imbued with genuine, heartfelt concern. "Mrs. Gardner, are you okay?" Eloise offered a small, almost imperceptible nod, her expression still calm, still unperturbed, her gaze still fixed serenely out the window, her quiet composure a stark contrast to the chaotic storm raging within the cabin. "I'm fine," she replied softly, her voice steady, reassuring, utterly devoid of self-pity, her quiet dignity a shield against the lingering sting of violence, the raw ugliness of unprovoked aggression. Emily hesitated, her gaze shifting nervously between Eloise's calm demeanor and the receding figure of Danielle marching toward the cockpit, her mind racing, her thoughts a whirlwind of uncertainty, of apprehension, of a dawning realization that something profoundly wrong, something irrevocably broken had just occurred. "Should I?" she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper, her words trailing off, unfinished, inadequate to express the complex swirl of emotions churning within her, the rising tide of unease, the growing sense of impending doom. Should I get someone? Eloise glanced down briefly at her phone, the sleek device resting innocently on her lap, the screen dark, its secrets carefully guarded, its quiet power subtly, yet undeniably asserted. I already have, she replied, her voice calm, knowing, utterly devoid of any hint of panic, any trace of alarm, any flicker of fear. Emily blinked, her brow furrowing in confusion, her eyes widening slightly in dawning realization. Who? Eloise gave a small, knowing smile, a subtle curve of her lips that betrayed a quiet amusement, a profound self-possession, a silent, unwavering certainty that transcended the chaotic storm raging around her. But she didn't answer, didn't elaborate, didn't betray any further hint of the forces she had so silently, so decisively set in motion. She simply picked up her worn leather purse, its weight familiar, comforting in her hands, and placed it neatly, deliberately on her lap, her movements precise, economical, utterly unperturbed by the escalating drama, her posture erect, her gaze returning serenely to the window, her silence a shield, her composure a fortress, her stillness a weapon far more potent, far more devastating than any shouted accusation, any enraged outburst, any physical act of violence. She was waiting, patiently, calmly, undeniably, powerfully. Danielle Callaway, in her arrogance, in her unchecked prejudice, in her blind pursuit of perceived authority, had made a terrible mistake. She had ignited a fuse, lit the match, set in motion a chain reaction of consequences she couldn't possibly comprehend, a storm of retribution she couldn't possibly hope to weather. And Eloise Gardner, with a single text, with quiet dignity, with unwavering resolve, was about to unleash it all. Danielle's breath came in shallow, ragged gasps as she stepped back from the intercom, her hand trembling, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Charles Gardner. The name alone, spoken through the sterile crackle of the intercom, sent a wave of icy dread washing over her, chilling her to the bone, freezing the blood in her veins. Charles Gardner, the man who owned the Airline, the man who held her career, her future, her very livelihood, in the palm of his hand. Her throat went dry, constricted with fear, her carefully constructed facade of professional composure crumbling completely, dissolving into a puddle of abject terror. She had just slapped his wife, passengers in first class, their earlier feigned disinterest now completely abandoned, were no longer pretending to be uninterested, their hushed whispers now escalating into open murmurs, their gazes fixed on Danielle, dissecting her every movement, their faces a mixture of morbid curiosity and a dawning understanding of the gravity of the unfolding situation. Some shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their earlier voyeuristic fascination now replaced by a palpable unease, a collective sense of impending doom, while others, their eyes wide with anticipation, their breath held captive in their chests, stared openly waiting, with a mixture of morbid fascination and a nascent sense of vindication, for the inevitable hammer blow to fall, for the swift, brutal consequences to be unleashed. The intercom crackled again, the sudden sound making Danielle jump, her nerves stretched taut, her body recoiling instinctively from the disembodied voice, the unseen presence, the quiet, chilling authority that now permeated the cabin like a palpable chill. And this time, Charles Gardner's voice, echoing to the cabin, was even calmer, even colder, even more dangerous. "Miss Callaway," he said, his voice low, measured, utterly devoid of emotion, yet carrying a weight of unspoken threat, a chilling certainty that sent shivers down Danielle's spine. "Miss Callaway," he repeated, his voice now sharper, more insistent, more demanding of her immediate, undivided attention. "I asked you a question." He paused, the silence stretching, becoming almost unbearable, the unspoken question hanging heavy in the air, pregnant with unspoken consequences, laced with a chilling promise of retribution. "Would you," he finally continued, his voice dropping to a near whisper, yet carried with the force of physical blow, "would you like to repeat what you just said?" Danielle's lips parted, her mouth opening and closing soundlessly, her vocal cords paralyzed by fear, her mind blank, utterly devoid of coherent thought, utterly incapable of formulating any plausible excuse, any mitigating defense, any desperate plea for mercy. No words came out. Emily, still crouched beside Eloise, felt the sheer, suffocating weight of the moment, the palpable tension vibrating through the cabin, the unspoken dread hanging heavy in the air like a suffocating fog. She let out a small, involuntary breath, a hushed whisper of horrified recognition, a quiet articulation of the dawning realization that Danielle Callaway's carefully constructed world was about to crumble, to shatter, to dissolve into nothingness. "Oh, no," Emily whispered, her voice barely audible, her words laced with a mixture of pity and a chilling, undeniable certainty. "Oh, no." Danielle swallowed hard, her throat dry, constricted with fear, the unspoken threat hanging heavy in the air, the chilling silence amplifying the pounding of her own heart, the frantic drumming of impending doom echoing in her ears. Charles Gardner. She repeated the name silently to herself, as if simply uttering the syllables, pronouncing the words aloud, would somehow magically alter the terrifying reality of her situation, would somehow conjure a way out of the inescapable consequences of her own actions. Charles Gardner. The name alone, the mere utterance of those two syllables, sent a wave of icy dread washing over her, chilling her to the bone, freezing the blood in her veins, paralyzing her with fear. She had worked in this airline for years, for what felt like a lifetime, a decade dedicated to climbing the corporate ladder, to securing her position, to solidify her authority within the carefully orchestrated hierarchy of the aviation industry, long enough to know, to understand, to instinctively recognize the names of most powerful figures, the unseen forces that pulled the strings, that controlled the levers of power, that shaped the destinies of everyone within the vast, sprawling, corporate empire of the airline industry. And Charles Gardner. He wasn't just a shareholder, not merely an anonymous face on a shareholder registry, not simply a name mentioned in hushed tones in executive boardrooms. He was a majority owner, the man who had built this airline from the ground up, brick by painstaking brick, flight by meticulously planned flight, passenger by carefully cultivated passenger, the man who held the ultimate power, the man who could and demonstrably would end careers, shatter lives, extinguish dreams with a single dismissive phone call with a quiet, unshakable command. Her throat went dry, her mouth parched, her tongue thick and useless. She had just slapped his wife. Passengers in first class were no longer feigning disinterest, no longer pretending to be absorbed in their magazines, no longer subtly eavesdropping on the unfolding drama. They had abandoned all pretense, all facade of detachment, all vestige of indifference. Some shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their bodies fidgeting, their gazes darting nervously between Danielle and the unseen figure of power on the other end of the intercom, their postures radiating a palpable unease, a shared apprehension, a collective holding of breath, while others, their initial shock now replaced by a morbid fascination, stared openly, their eyes wide with anticipation, their faces etched with a mixture of fear, fascination, and a dawning realization that they were witnessing something truly extraordinary, something undeniably consequential, waiting breathless for what would happen next, for the inevitable hammer blow to fall, for the swift, brutal consequences to be unleashed. The intercom crackled again, the sudden sound making Danielle jump, her nerves stretched taut, her body recoiling instinctively from the disembodied voice, the unseen presence, the quiet, chilling authority that now permeated the cabin like a palpable chill. And this time, Charles's voice, echoing to the cabin, was even calmer, even colder, even more dangerous. "Miss Callaway," he said, his voice low, measured, utterly devoid of emotion, yet carrying a weight of unspoken threat, a chilling certainty that sent shivers down Danielle's spine. "Miss Callaway," he repeated, his voice now sharper, more insistent, more demanding of her immediate, undivided attention. "I asked you a question." He paused again, the silence stretching, becoming almost unbearable, the unspoken question hanging heavy in the air, pregnant with unspoken consequences, laced with a chilling promise of retribution. "Would you?" he finally continued, his voice dropping to a near whisper, yet carried with the force of physical blow. "Would you like to repeat what you just said?" Danielle's lips parted, her mouth opening and closing soundlessly, her vocal cords paralyzed by fear, her mind blank, utterly devoid of coherent thought, utterly incapable of formulating any plausible excuse, any mitigating defense, any desperate plea for mercy. No words came out. Emily, still crouched beside Eloise, felt the sheer, suffocating weight of the moment, the palpable tension vibrating through the cabin, the unspoken dread hanging heavy in the air like a suffocating fog. She let out a small, involuntary breath, a hushed whisper of horrified recognition, a quiet articulation of the dawning realization that Danielle Callaway's carefully constructed world was about to crumble, to shatter, to dissolve into nothingness. "Oh, no," Emily whispered, her voice barely audible, her words laced with a mixture of pity and a chilling, undeniable certainty. "Oh, no." Danielle's hands trembled slightly, her fingers fumbling nervously as she stepped back from the intercom, the cold plastic of the device now feeling clammy, repulsive against her skin. Her heartbeat pounded in her ears, a frantic drumbeat against the suffocating silence of the first-class cabin. Charles Gardner. The name echoed in her mind, a chilling mantra, a terrifying pronouncement of impending doom. The name alone sent a wave of icy dread washing over her, chilling her to the bone, freezing the blood in her veins. She had worked in this airline for years, for what felt like a lifetime, a decade dedicated to climbing the corporate ladder, to securing her position, to solidify her authority within the carefully orchestrated hierarchy of the aviation industry, long enough to know, to understand, to instinctively recognize the names of the most powerful figures, the unseen forces that pulled the strings, that controlled the levers of power, that shaped the destinies of everyone within the vast, sprawling, corporate empire of the airline industry. And Charles Gardner, he wasn't just a name on a spreadsheet, not simply a figurehead on a corporate chart. He was the architect, the builder, the very foundation of the airline itself. He was the ultimate authority, the final word, the unquestioned ruler of their meticulously constructed world. Her throat went dry, her mouth parched, her tongue thick and useless. She had just slapped his wife. Passengers in first class, their earlier feigned disinterest now completely abandoned, their subtle eavesdropping now blatant, unashamed scrutiny. Some shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their bodies fidgeting, their gazes darting nervously between Danielle and the unseen figure power on the other end of the intercom, while others, their initial shock now giving way to morbid fascination, stared openly, their eyes wide with anticipation, their faces etched with a mixture of fear, fascination, and a dawning realization that they were witnessing something truly extraordinary, something undeniably consequential. The intercom crackled again, the sudden sound making Danielle jump, her nerves stretched taut, her body recoiling instinctively from the disembodied voice, the unseen presence, the quiet, chilling authority that now permeated the cabin like a palpable chill. And this time, Charles's voice, echoing to the cabin, was even calmer, even colder, even more dangerous. "Miss Callaway," he said, his voice low, measured, utterly devoid of emotion, yet carrying a weight of unspoken threat, a chilling certainty that sent shivers down Danielle's spine. "I asked you a question." He paused again, the silence stretching, becoming almost unbearable, the unspoken question hanging heavy in the air, pregnant with unspoken consequences, laced with a chilling promise of retribution. "Would you?" he finally continued, his voice dropping to a near whisper, yet carried with it the force of physical blow. "Would you like to repeat what you just said?" Danielle's lips parted, her mouth opening and closing soundlessly, her vocal cords paralyzed by fear, her mind blank, utterly devoid of coherent thought, utterly incapable of formulating any plausible excuse, any mitigating defense, any desperate plea for mercy. No words came out. Emily, still crouched beside Eloise, felt the sheer, suffocating weight of the moment, the palpable tension vibrating through the cabin, the unspoken dread hanging heavy in the air like a suffocating fog. She let out a small, involuntary breath, a hushed whisper of horrified recognition, a quiet articulation of the dawning realization that Danielle Callaway's carefully constructed world was about to crumble, to shatter, to dissolve into nothingness. "Oh, no," Emily whispered, her voice barely audible, her words laced with a mixture of pity and a chilling, undeniable certainty. Oh, no. Danielle's hands trembled slightly, her fingers fumbling nervously as she stepped back on the intercom, the cold plastic of the device now feeling clammy, repulsive against her skin. Her heartbeat pounded in her ears, a frantic drumbeat against the suffocating silence of the first-class cabin. Charles Gardner. The name echoed in her mind, a chilling mantra, a terrifying pronouncement of impending doom. The name alone sent a wave of icy dread washing over her, chilling her to the bone, freezing the blood in her veins. She had worked in this airline for years, for what felt like a lifetime, a decade dedicated to climbing the corporate ladder, to securing her position, to solidify her authority within the carefully orchestrated hierarchy of the aviation industry, long enough to know, to understand, to instinctively recognize the names of the most powerful figures, the unseen forces that pulled the strings, that controlled the levers of power, that shaped the destinies of everyone within the vast, sprawling, corporate empire of the airline industry. And Charles Gardner, he wasn't just a name on a spreadsheet, not merely an anonymous face on a shareholder registry, not simply a figurehead on a corporate chart. He was an architect, the builder, the very foundation of the airline itself. He was the ultimate authority, the final word, the unquestioned ruler of their meticulously constructed world. Her throat went dry, her mouth parched, her tongue thick and useless. She had just slapped his wife. Passengers in first class were no longer feigning disinterest, no longer pretending to be absorbed in their magazines, no longer subtly eavesdropping on the unfolding drama. They had abandoned all pretense, all facade of detachment, all vestige of indifference. Some shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their bodies fidgeting, their gazes darting nervously between Danielle and the unseen figure power on the other end of the intercom, while others, their initial shock now giving way to a morbid fascination, stared openly, their eyes wide with anticipation, their faces etched with a mixture of fear, fascination, and a dawning realization that they were witnessing something truly extraordinary, something undeniably consequential, waiting breathless for what would happen next, for the inevitable hammer blow to fall, for the swift, brutal consequences to be unleashed. The intercom clicked off abruptly, cutting off Charles Gardner's chilling voice, leaving behind a silence even more oppressive, even more pregnant with unspoken dread. The cockpit door, a solid metal barrier separating the hushed cabin from the unseen figures of authority beyond, swung open with a slow, deliberate creak, its heavy hinges protesting slightly against the sudden movement. Captain Jonathan Pierce stepped out, emerging from the sterile confines of the cockpit into fraught atmosphere of first class, his face unreadable, his expression a carefully constructed mask of professional detachment, masking whatever turbulent emotions churned beneath the surface. He was a man in his late 50s, his hair neatly combed, a distinguished streak of silver at his temples, hinting at years of experience, years of command, years of bearing responsibility for the lives entrusted to his care. His posture was erect, his movements precise, his presence radiating an aura of quiet authority, the unspoken command of a seasoned professional who rarely needed to raise his voice to be obeyed. He adjusted his crisp captain's cap slightly, the gesture deliberate, measured, a subtle act of self-assertion, a visual confirmation of his unwavering authority, his unshakable control. Then, in a voice so firm, so controlled, so imbued with an unwavering authority that resonated to the hushed cabin, making the hairs on Danielle's arm stand up, chilling her to the bone, he spoke, his words clipped, precise, utterly devoid of emotion, utterly devoid of sympathy, utterly devoid of any hint of negotiation. "Miss Callaway," he said, his voice steady, unwavering, cutting through the lingering tension like a honed blade. "Miss Callaway," he repeated, his gaze fixed on Danielle, his expression unwavering, his tone leaving no room for doubt, no room for argument, no room for appeal. "Follow me. Now." Danielle hesitated, her heart pounding against her ribs, her breath catching in her throat, her mind racing, desperately searching for some escape, some reprieve, some way to alter the inevitable course of her impending downfall. "Captain, she stammered, her voice barely audible, her words trailing off, unfinished, inadequate to express the torrent of fear, panic, and desperate pleading that threatened to overwhelm her. But he didn't let her finish, didn't allow her to utter a single word of protest, didn't offer a single flicker of sympathy, a single hint of compassion. "That Captain Pierce stated, his voice sharp, clipped, utterly devoid of inflection, leaving no room for ambiguity, no room for misinterpretation. That wasn't a request, Miss Callaway. A heavy hush fell over first-class cabin, the silence now even more oppressive, more pregnant with unspoken tension than before, as passengers, their gazes riveted, their breath held captive in their chests, watched the unfolding scene with a mixture of morbid fascination, quiet apprehension, and a dawning sense of grim inevitability. Emily, the younger flight attendant, rose slowly, deliberately, to her feet, stepping slightly away from Danielle, her posture betraying a mixture of pity, unease, and a quiet, unspoken sense of resignation. As Danielle, her face ashen, her movements slow, mechanical, utterly devoid of volition, turned stiffly, reluctantly, and began to walk, a virtual prisoner in her own uniform, towards the open cockpit door, towards the unseen forces of authority gathering beyond. Captain Pierce led her inside, his hand gesturing curtly towards confined space, shutting the door firmly, decisively, behind them, sealing Danielle's fate within the sterile, unforgiving walls of the cockpit, leaving behind a cabin filled with hushed whispers, anxious glances, and a palpable sense of impending doom. Emily looked down at Eloise, then at the phone resting innocently on her armrest. A single new message, its sender and content unspoken yet undeniably present, illuminated on the dark screen. Charles Gardner. Stay seated. I'm handling it. Emily's stomach twisted, a cold knot of dread forming in the pit of her stomach, a chilling premonition of the storm that was about to break, of the devastation that was about to be unleashed, of the irreversible consequences that were about to befall Danielle Callaway. She had a bad feeling, a profoundly, gut-wrenchingly bad feeling that whatever was about to happen next in the hushed confines of the cockpit, in the sterile anonymity of the airport terminal, in the unforgiving glare of the corporate world, wasn't going to be quiet.